Have you ever had someone you've never met completely turn your world upside down with just a few words? Well, that's exactly what happened to me. And the crazy part, I didn't even hear those words directly. But let me start from the beginning, because my story shows how quickly everything you think you know about your life can crumble. Before I go any further, don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments below, and hit that subscribe button to stay updated with all our latest stories. Trust me, this one's going to make you think twice about the comfortable life you might be living. It's strange, isn't it? How a handful of words from a complete stranger can shake everything you believed was rock solid. That's what happened to me, Helen, just last spring. And even now, months later, I'm still trying to understand how it all began. My husband Richard and we'd been married for 27 long years. 27 years of shared breakfasts, arguments about the thermostat, and quiet Sunday mornings reading the paper together. We had what most people would call a good life. Not perfect, whose life ever is, but genuinely good, comfortable, safe. We'd raised two amazing kids together. Emily, our oldest, was now 25 and working as a teacher in Cincinnati. Mark, our youngest, had just turned 23 and was finishing up his master's degree in engineering, following in his dad's footsteps. Both kids were independent now, building their own lives, calling home every Sunday like clockwork. Richard worked as a senior engineer at Midwest Manufacturing, a solid company where he'd climbed the ladder slowly but steadily for nearly 15 years. He wasn't the type to make waves or demand attention. He was reliable, steady, the kind of man who showed up early and stayed late when needed. Sometimes, if I'm being completely honest, maybe he was a little too predictable. But isn't that what marriage is supposed to be about? Knowing what to expect. Our house was a cozy 2-story colonial in Riverside Heights, a quiet suburb in Ohio where neighbors still waved to each other and kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on. Every room was filled with memories, family photos covering the mantle. Emily's art projects still stuck to the refrigerator even though she'd been gone for years. Mark's old baseball trophies gathering dust on the bookshelf. Our evenings had settled into a comfortable rhythm over the years. I'd cook dinner while listening to the local news. Richard would come home around 6, loosen his tie, and tell me about his day while I set the table. After dinner, we'd watch a little television together, usually the History Channel or those home improvement shows. Then Richard would head out to his workshop in the garage, tinkering with whatever project had caught his interest that week. Meanwhile, I'd curl up with a book or catch up with old friends on Facebook. It was a life built on gentle routines, predictable patterns that gave me comfort. I found peace in knowing that Wednesday was grocery shopping day, that Saturday mornings meant pancakes and coffee while we planned our weekend projects, that Sunday evenings, we'd call the kids and hear about their weeks. Looking back now, maybe I should have seen the signs. Maybe I should have noticed that our conversations had become shorter, more practical. Did you pay the electric bill? Don't forget your dentist appointment tomorrow. The lawnmower is making that noise again. When had we stopped talking about dreams, hopes, the future beyond weekend plans? But I didn't see it then. I was content, settled in our comfortable bubble. I thought Richard was too. The day everything started to unravel was a Tuesday in early May. I remember it clearly because Richard always had his weekly team meetings on Tuesdays, and he'd come home a little more wound up than usual on those days. The meetings always seemed to drain him somehow. That particular Tuesday, the weather was beautiful, one of those perfect spring days that made you want to throw open all the windows and start planning summer vacations. I'd spent the afternoon working in my flower garden, planting the petunias I'd bought on sale at the nursery. My hands were still dirty when Richard's car pulled into the driveway at 6:15, right on schedule. He walked into the kitchen looking tired, his shoulders sagging slightly under his navy blue suit jacket. His graying hair was a little messy, probably from running his hands through it during the meeting, a habit he'd developed over the years when he was stressed. "Long day?" I asked, the way I always did, while I started chopping vegetables for the stir-fry I'd planned. The kitchen smelled wonderful, fresh ginger and garlic, the scent of soy sauce warming in the pan. Richard loosened his tie and slumped into one of our kitchen chairs with a heavy sigh. "You could say that," he muttered, rubbing his temples. "Management has some new bright ideas about restructuring the department. More meetings, more paperwork, less time to actually get work done." I made sympathetic sounds while I continued chopping, letting him vent. After 27 years, I'd learned when Richard needed to talk and when he just needed someone to listen. This was definitely a listening moment. And then there's Mark Jenkins, Richard continued, his voice taking on that particular tone of frustration. I'd come to recognize. Guy thinks he knows everything. Fresh out of graduate school for what? 3 years. And he's got all these ideas about how we should be doing things differently. I nodded, only half paying attention, if I'm being honest. Mark Jenkins was a name I'd heard before, usually accompanied by Richard shaking his head or making that clicking sound with his tongue that meant he was annoyed. From what I'd gathered over the months, Jenkins was younger, ambitious, full of new ideas that didn't always mesh well with the way things had been done for years. In my mind, I'd painted a pretty clear picture of this Mark Jenkins. Probably wore expensive suits, had perfectly styled hair, talked loudly in meetings, used a lot of business jargon. Just another young hotshot trying to make his mark by changing things that didn't need changing. I'd worked in offices before I became a stay-at-home mom, and I knew the type. What's he stirring up now? I asked, more to show I was listening. Then, because I really wanted to know the details, Richard waved his hand dismissively. Just the usual. Thinks we need to modernize everything, implement new software systems, change procedures that have worked fine for years. He doesn't understand that some of us have been doing this longer than he's been alive. I smiled and reached over to squeeze Richard's hand. Well, he'll learn. They always do. Remember when Dave started? He had all sorts of grand plans too. And now look at him, he's one of your best friends. Richard smiled back, some of the tension leaving his face. You're right. I just wish he'd stop acting like he's trying to save the department single-handedly. We moved on to other topics. Emily's new apartment. The strange noise the washing machine was making, whether we should plant tomatoes this year or stick with peppers. Normal, everyday conversations that felt safe and familiar. I didn't give Mark Jenkins another thought that evening. Why would I? He was just another work annoyance, a minor character in Richard's daily drama. I had no way of knowing that this man I'd never met, whose name I barely remembered, would soon become the center of my whole world. How could I have possibly known that something Mark Jenkins said, something he probably didn't even think twice about, would shake the very foundation of everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my husband, and myself? It wasn't Richard who told me what Jenkins had said. My dear husband, bless his heart, has always tried to shield me from what he calls unnecessary workplace drama. He thinks I have enough to worry about without adding his office politics to the mix. Most of the time, I appreciate this protective instinct of his. But sometimes, like in this case, being protected means being left in the dark about things that might actually matter. No. The news came from Carol Peterson, the wife of Richard's closest work friend, Dave. Carol and I weren't best friends, exactly, but we'd developed a comfortable friendship over the years. We met for coffee every few weeks, exchanged Christmas cards with handwritten notes, and both belonged to the same book club that met twice a month at different members' houses. Carol was a nice woman, a little gossipy maybe, but not in a mean-spirited way. She was the type who genuinely cared about people and sometimes shared information because she thought you should know, not because she wanted to cause trouble. She'd been married to Dave for almost as long as Richard and I had been together, so she understood the ups and downs of long marriages. The book club meeting was held that week at Susan Mitchell's house, a beautiful Victorian with way too much floral print for my taste. But Susan loved it. We'd been discussing the latest historical novel, something about World War II resistance fighters, but the conversation had started to wind down as it always did around 9 o'clock. That's when the real socializing began. Susan brought out her famous lemon cake and fresh coffee, and we all settled into the overstuffed armchairs and sofa in her living room. The lighting was soft and warm, and outside you could hear the gentle sounds of a spring evening, crickets chirping, the distant hum of traffic, someone's dog barking playfully. There were 6 of us that night. Me, Carol, Susan, Margaret from down the street, Linda who worked at the library, and Janet whose husband taught at the community college. We'd moved on from discussing the book to catching up on family news, neighborhood gossip, and the general business of our lives. Carol was sitting next to me on Susan's floral sofa, balancing her coffee cup carefully on her knee. I noticed she seemed a little fidgety, glancing around the room like she was making sure no one else was listening to our conversation. She had that look on her face, the one people get when they're carrying news they're not sure they should share. Helen, she said quietly, leaning closer to me. Her voice was barely above a whisper, and she kept looking around as if she expected someone to be eavesdropping from behind the chintz curtains. Something in her tone made my stomach tighten just a little. "What is it, Carol?" She fiddled with her napkin, folding and unfolding it nervously. Carol had always been direct, so this hesitation was unusual for her. "Dave told me something today, something that happened at work. I wasn't sure if I should mention it, but..." She trailed off, clearly wrestling with whether to continue. "But what?" I prompted, trying to keep my voice light even though a small alarm bell was starting to ring in the back of my mind. "It's about Richard," she said finally. "Well, it's about something Mark Jenkins said about Richard. I don't know if you know who that is." "I know the name," I said carefully. "Richard mentions him sometimes." "What about him?" Carol took a deep breath, as if she was steeling herself for what came next. "You know that big client presentation Richard's team did last week? The one Richard was so stressed about?" I nodded. Richard had been working late for days preparing for that presentation, practicing his part over and over in the living room while I watched. It was some major account that could mean a lot of business for the company. He'd been nervous about it, which wasn't like him. Usually, Richard was confident in his professional abilities. "Well," Carol continued, "apparently after the presentation went well and Dave said it went really well. By the way, Jenkins was in the break room talking to some of the newer employees. You know how these young guys are, always clustering together, talking about work like they're going to revolutionize the industry." She paused to take a sip of her coffee, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting for whatever was coming next. Dave was getting coffee, and he overheard Jenkins talking. Dave said Jenkins didn't know he was there. He was around the corner at the coffee machine. "What did he say?" I asked, though part of me already didn't want to know. Carol's expression grew more troubled. Jenkins was talking about the presentation, praising different team members. But then he said, she stopped and looked at me directly. He said it was a shame that Richard was so set in his ways. He said that someone with Richard's experience and knowledge should be aiming higher, pushing for bigger projects, taking more leadership roles. My heart started beating a little faster, but I tried to stay calm. "That doesn't sound so terrible," I said, though even as I said it, I could sense there was more coming. "That's not the worst part," Carol said softly. "Jenkins said Richard seemed to be coasting toward retirement, just going through the motions. And then he said," she hesitated again, clearly reluctant to repeat the exact words. "What did he say, Carol?" "He said, it's like Richard has just given up trying to make a real mark anymore. He's talented enough to be running his own department, but he seems content to just keep his head down and collect his paycheck." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my coffee cup shake slightly in my hands, and I had to concentrate on setting it down carefully on Susan's antique coffee table. Coasting toward retirement, given up trying to make a real mark, just collecting a paycheck. These phrases swirled around in my mind, each one stinging more than the last. This was my Richard we were talking about, Richard who spent hours perfecting reports that no one else would even notice. Richard who stayed late to help younger colleagues understand complex engineering problems. Richard, who took pride in his work even when it went unrecognized. But even as I felt anger rising up in defense of my husband, there was something else creeping in. A tiny, unwelcome voice in the back of my mind asking, what if there's some truth to this? What if Richard really has been just going through the motions? Dave was pretty upset about it, Carol continued, apparently not noticing how pale I'd probably gone. He said Jenkins has this way of talking that makes everything sound reasonable and professional, even when he's basically criticizing someone behind their back. You know that smooth corporate speak some of these younger guys have? I managed to nod, but my mind was reeling. Was this just office politics? Was Jenkins trying to position himself for a promotion by subtly undermining more senior colleagues? Or was he genuinely expressing an observation that others might share? I'm sorry I told you, Carol said, reaching out to touch my arm. Maybe I shouldn't have. But Dave was so bothered by it, and I thought, well, I thought you should know. Sometimes these things have a way of getting around, and it's better to hear it from a friend. No, I'm glad you told me, I said automatically, though I wasn't sure that was true. Jenkins sounds like he's just trying to make himself look good by putting others down. That's exactly what Dave said, Carol agreed. He thinks Jenkins is ambitious and probably sees Richard as competition for the next senior position that opens up. We talked for a few more minutes about office politics and ambitious young employees, but I was barely participating in the conversation. My mind kept circling back to those words, coasting toward retirement, given up trying to make a real mark. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I smiled and laughed at the right moments, said goodbye to everyone with my usual warmth, but inside I felt like something fundamental had shifted. It was as if Carol's words had turned on a bright light. In a room I'd been comfortable sitting in the dark, and now I could see things I'd been missing. The drive home took about 15 minutes, but it felt much longer. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, trying to analyze Jenkins' words from every possible angle. Was he just being petty? Was he threatened by Richard's experience? Or had he identified something real that I'd been too close to see? By the time I pulled into our driveway, I'd worked myself into a state of quiet anxiety that felt completely foreign to me. Our house looked exactly the same as always: the porch light Richard had left on for me, the carefully maintained lawn, the flower beds I'd spent the afternoon working in. But somehow everything felt different now, as if I was seeing it all through new eyes. Richard was in the living room when I came in, watching the late news with the sound turned low. He looked up and smiled when he heard me come in. "How was book club?" he asked. "Did you ladies solve all the world's problems?" "The usual," I said, trying to sound normal. "Susan made that lemon cake you like. I should have brought you a piece next time," he said, patting the couch cushion next to him. "Come sit. There's a story on here about that new bridge project downtown." I sat down beside him, but I found myself studying his profile as he watched the television. Was there something different about him that I'd been missing? Some sign of discontent or resignation that I'd been too comfortable to notice? He looked the same as always: graying hair that was still thick, laugh lines around his eyes, the small scar on his chin from a childhood accident. He was wearing his favorite weekend clothes, old jeans and a soft flannel shirt I'd given him for Christmas years ago. He looked content, relaxed, exactly like the man I'd been married to for 27 years. But Jenkins' words kept echoing in my mind. Coasting toward retirement, given up trying to make a real mark. I lay awake for a long time that night, staring at the ceiling while Richard slept peacefully beside me. His breathing was steady and deep, the way it always was. Everything was exactly the same as it had been that morning, but somehow everything felt completely different. That was the beginning of what I now think of as my before and after moment. Before Carol told me what Mark Jenkins had said, I was a content wife living a comfortable life. After that conversation, I became someone else entirely: someone who questioned everything, someone who couldn't stop thinking about a man I'd never met, and words he'd probably forgotten the moment he said them. I had no idea that this was just the beginning, that Mark Jenkins would soon become much more than just a name Richard occasionally complained about. I couldn't have imagined that I would soon find myself obsessing over this stranger, trying to understand him, even planning to meet him. But that night, as I lay in the dark listening to my husband breathe, all I knew was that something had fundamentally changed. A seed of doubt had been planted, and I could already feel it starting to grow. Looking more like someone enjoying a day out with friends than a corporate shark, he had an easy confidence about him, a way of holding himself that drew people in. I watched him for a while, trying to reconcile this image with the man who had, according to Carol, so dismissively critiqued my husband. He didn't look arrogant exactly, but there was an intensity in his eyes when he spoke, a focused energy that was palpable even from a distance. I took a deep breath and decided that just observing wasn't enough. I needed to understand, even if it was just a little. I walked over to the drinks table, feigning interest in the selection of sodas and iced tea, positioning myself closer to his group. It was a clumsy move, I know, but I wasn't sure what else to do. As luck or perhaps fate would have it, Mark Jenkins himself broke away from his group and headed towards the same table, presumably for a refill. He had a friendly smile on his face, a stark contrast to the villain I had half expected. He nodded politely. Ash reached for a cup. "Enjoying the party?" he asked, his voice pleasant, nothing like a cutting tone. I'd imagined this was my chance, however small. "Yes, it's a lovely day for it," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm Helen, by the way, Richard Miller's wife." His eyes lit up with a flicker of something: recognition, surprise. "Oh, Richard's wife. It's great to finally meet you," he said, extending his hand. "Mark Jenkins. I work with Richard quite a bit." His handshake was firm, confident. There was nothing covertly offensive about him, nothing that screamed backstabber. He seemed personable, even, dare I say it, likable. This was not what I had prepared myself for. "Richard mentions you," I said, trying for a neutral tone. "Hetchickled, a surprisingly warm sound. I hope It's not all complaints about the demanding younger generation. He a self-deprecating smile. We do have different approaches sometimes, but I have a huge amount of respect for Richard. His experience is invaluable. This was at the opening, but the words caught in my throat. How cool to bring up something so awkward, so accusatory at a family barbecue, with his friendly gaze on me. Instead, I found myself saying, he's very dedicated. Mark nodded, his expression turning more serious. He absolutely is. In fact, Hephaus, looking around as if to ensure privacy that we were still in a relatively open space, he leaned in slightly. Can I be frank, Helen, since you're Richard's wife, perhaps? You'd understand. I sometimes worry that Richard, well, that he doesn't get the recognition he truly deserves around here. He's got so much more to offer. My mind reeled. This was so different from dismissive coasting comment Carol had relayed. This sounded like concerned admiration. Even could Carol have misunderstood, or had Dave misheard? Or was Jenkins just incredibly skilled at saying the right thing to the right person? The discrepancy was jarring. He continued, his voice earnest. He's a brilliant engineer, one of the best, but company, well, it sometimes overlooks the quiet contributors, the ones who aren't constantly tooting their own horn. He looked directly at me. I've actually been trying to find ways to highlight his contributions more, to make sure management sees the full scope of his expertise. I was speechless. This man, the supposed source of Muniz, was now painting a picture of himself as Richard's advocate. The ground felt like it was shifting beneath my feet. The subtle tension I'd been carrying for weeks was now amplified by a profound confusion. Was Mark Jenkins a Machiavellian manipulator or a genuinely well-intentioned colleague? And what did this mean for Richard and for my understanding of his life at work? The casual, sunny atmosphere of the barbecue suddenly felt charged with an undercurrent I couldn't decipher. My initial mission to simply observe had morphed into something far more complex. I felt more torn than ever, but now the conflict was not just about what was said, but about who this Mark Jenkins truly was and what his unexpected words really meant. My conversation with Mark Jenkins at the barbecue were played in my mind for days. His words, so different from what Carol had reported, had thrown me completely off balance. He's got so much more to offer. I've actually been trying to find ways to highlight his contributions. These weren't the phrase of someone who thought Richard was coasting or had given up. It was the complete opposite. Could Carol have gotten it so wrong, or Dave? It seemed unlikely they would intentionally mislead me. Perhaps the original comment was made, but the context, the nuance had been lost in translation. Or maybe, and this thought was more unsettling, Jenkins was adept at playing different tunes for different audiences. The confusion was a knock in my stomach. I found myself oscillating between suspicion and a tentative hope that maybe things weren't as I'd feared. Maybe Richard wasn't being supply undermined at work. Maybe someone actually saw his worth, even if Richard himself was too modest to showcase it. I decided I couldn't let it rest there. The discrepancy was too large, the implications too significant. I needed more information, but I was still hesitant to involve Richard directly. He seemed happier since the barbecue, more relaxed. The project he'd been working on had indeed been a success, and he'd even mentioned with a touch of surprise that Mark Jenkins had publicly praised his role in it during a team meeting. Young Jenkins can be a bit much sometimes, Richard had chuckled over dinner one night, but he's sharp, I'll give him that, and he actually had some good things to say about my designs for the new component. Surprised the heck out of Methus only added to my perplexity. Was Jenkins genuinely trying to support Richard? If so, where did that initial negative comment come from? I felt like I was navigating a maze with no map. My opportunity for more clarity came unexpectedly. About a week after the barbecue, I was having coffee with Carolee'd been debating whether to bring up my encounter with Jenkins, unsure how she'd react, but she brought him up first, so she said, stirring her latte with a little too much vigor, did you happen to see Mark Jenkins at the barbecue? Dave was keeping an eye on him. Still thinks he's a bit of a snake in grass. I took a careful sip of my own coffee. Actually, Carol, I spoke to him. Harry brows shot up. You did? What did he say? Was insufferable. I hesitated, then decided to be direct. Honestly, he was perfectly pleasant, and he said some very positive things about Richard, about his experience, his contributions. He even said he thought Richard deserved more recognition. Carol stared at me, her spoon clinking against her cup. Well, I'll be, she said slowly. That's not what Dave heard him saying that day in the rake room. Not at all. Are you sure about what Dave heard? I asked gently. I mean, could there have been a misunderstanding? Carol frowned, thoughtful. Dave was pretty clear. Jenkins was definitely talking about Richard coasting and being set in his ways. He was quite indignant on Richard's behalf. But, she paused. Dave also said Jenkins is incredibly ambitious. Maybe he realized bad-mouthing a senior colleague wasn't a good look-in. Now he's trying to smooth things over. Or maybe he's playing some kind of political game. Her words brought back a wave of my initial suspicions. The political game angle felt plausible in a corporate environment, but there had been a sincerity in Jenkins's voice when he spoke to me, a genuine earnestness in his eyes. Or was I just being naive, too willing to believe the best? Because the alternative was so disheartening, I left my coffee with Carol, feeling even more conflicted. It seemed there were two: Mark Jenkins, the one who criticized Richard behind his back, and the one who praised him to his wife, and apparently in team meetings. How could both be true? I realized that to get to the bottom of this, I needed to understand Mark Jenkins himself, his motivations, his perspective, and perhaps, just perhaps, I needed to understand Richard's work life from an angle I'd never considered. The thought of deliberately seeking out Jenkins felt audacious, even a little foolish. What business was it of mine, really? But the desire to unravel this knot for Richard's sake and for my own peace of mind was becoming overwhelming. I found myself thinking about what he'd said: since you're Richard's wife, perhaps you'd understand. It was as if he'd opened a door, however, slightly. The following week I found myself in downtown Cleveland for an art exhibit I'd wanted to see. Ricker Dacefice building was only a few blocks away. On a sudden impulse, one that made me heart beat a little faster, I decided to walk by. It was lunchtime, and people were milling about on the sidewalks. As I approached the sleek modern skyscraper where Richard worked, I saw a familiar figure emerge from the revolving door, stalking animatively on his phone. It was Mark Jenkins. He was alone. This was it, a chance encounter, and scripted. Away from the forced conviviality of a company picnic, my mind raced. Should I approach him? What would I even say? Before I could overthink it, he ended his call and looked up, his gaze briefly meeting mine. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. He smiled. Helen, isn't it? Richard Miller's wife. Fancy meeting you here. It was now or never. Mark, hello, I said, trying to sound casual, as if running into him downtown was the most natural thing in the world. I was just at the art museum. Oh, the Impressionist exhibit? I've been meaning to check that out, he replied. Easily, an awkward pause hung in the air for a moment. I took a breath. Actually, Mark, I began, my voice a little shaky despite my resolve, I was wondering if I could talk to you for a few minutes about Richard and what you said at the barbecue. And well, about some other things I heard. His smile didn't falter, but his eyes sharpened with a new attentiveness. He glanced at his watch. I was just about to grab a quick lunch. There's a decent cafe around the corner. Would you care to join me? We could talk. There it was, a direct invitation, a willingness to engage, that surprised me. Part of me wanted to retreat, to murmur an excuse and walk away. But a stronger part, the part that needed answers, nodded. I'd like that, thank you. As we walked the short distance to the cafe, a quiet, modern place with minimalist decor, I felt a strange sense of unreality. Here I was about to have lunch with my husband's colleague, a man who was either a concerned supporter or a duplicitous schemer, all because of a few tuntling words. The subtle tension I'd been living with for weeks now felt like it was coiled tightly in my chest when we were seated at a small table by the window with sandwiches and iced teas ordered. Mark looked at me expectantly. So Helen, he said, his tone open, inviting. You mentioned some things you heard and what I said at the barbecue. I get the feeling there's some confusion and I'd be happy to clear up anything I can. His directness was disarming. I decided to mirror it. Mark, I started choosing my words carefully. I appreciate your candor at the barbecue. You spoke very highly of Richard, but I'd also heard indirectly that you'd previously made some less positive comments about him, specifically about him coasting and being set in his ways. He didn't flinch, listened intently, his gaze steady on mine. When I finished, he nodded slowly. Thank you for being straightforward, Helen. I appreciate that, and yes, I can see why that would be confusing and concerning for you. Hephaus gathering his thoughts. It's true, he said, his voice lower, now more serious. A while back, in a moment of frustration, I did say something along those lines to a couple of the junior guys. It was after a particularly challenging project meeting where Richard had been resistant to some new methodologies we were trying to implement. It was poor judgment on my part to voice my frustrations like that, especially where they could be overheard and misinterpreted, and for that I am genuinely sorry. It wasn't meant as A personal attack on Richard Moore, a comment on the challenges of change within a large organization and how established expertise can sometimes become a barrier to innovation if we're not careful. His admission, so direct and unapologetic, caught me off guard. He had expected denial or deflection or some corporate doublespeak. Instead, he owned it, but he continued, leaning forward slightly, his expression earnest. That comment didn't come from a place of disrespect for Richard, quite the opposite. In fact, it came from a place of believing he's capable of so much more. I see his talent, his incredible depth of knowledge, and yes, sometimes I get frustrated because I feel like the system, the company culture, even his own modesty holds him back from making the even bigger impact he's capable of. The coasting comment was a clumsy, ill-chosen way of expressing that frustration. It wasn't about him giving up, but about my desire to see him unleashed. I suppose he looked at me, his eyes searching mine. When I spoke to you at the barbecue, that was the truth. I do admire Richard. I do think he deserves more recognition, and I have been trying in my own way to advocate for him to ensure his skills are utilized and seen by the higher-ups. Perhaps my methods are sometimes unrefined. I'm still learning the nuances of navigating personalities and politics in a company this size. I sat there processing his words. It was a lot to take in. His explanation felt plausible. It painted a picture not of malice, but of youthful impatience, ambition, and perhaps a genuine, if awkwardly expressed, concern for Richard's potential. It didn't excuse the original comment, but it reframed it. It made Mark Jenkins a far more complex character than I had imagined. Not a villain, not a hero, but a human being with his own perspectives and flaws. So the things he said in the break room, I said slowly, it wasn't that you thought Richard was lazy or incompetent. Good heavens, no, Mark said, looking genuinely shocked. Absolutely not. Richard is one of an increasingly rare breed, a truly skilled engineer who understands things from the ground up. My frustration was that I felt he was sometimes content to let his light shine only in his own cubicle, so to speak, when it could be illuminating the whole department or even the company. I want him to be seen as the leader. He naturally is not just the reliable senior guy. A wave of emotion washed over me. It was relief, partly that the image of Richard being secretly belittled was perhaps inaccurate, but it was also something else, a dawning understanding of the complexities of Richard's professional world, a world I had only ever glimpsed from the outside, and a surprising, unexpected empathy for Mark Jenkins. He wasn't just a sharp suit or a corporate shark. He was young, driven, and perhaps saw in Richard a potential that even Rickard himself or I had started to overlook. In the comfortable rhythm of our lives, the conversation flowed more easily after that. We talked about the challenges of industry, the generational differences in work styles, his own career aspirations. He spoke with passion and a surprising degree of insight. I found myself listening, really listening, not as Richard's defensive wife, but as one dull engaging with another. There was a subtle shift in the atmosphere between us, a letting down of guards. The tension I'd carried for so long began to ease, replaced by a tentative sense of connection and understanding that transcended my initial misgivings. This lunch, born out of suspicion and anxiety, was turning into something else, entirely an unexpected moment of clarity and perhaps the beginning of a very personal discovery. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in weeks I felt a flicker of hope, a sense that this whole confusing episode might lead to something positive. After all, as our lunch with Mark Jenkins drew to a close, I felt a profound shift within me. The man I had mentally cast as a potential antagonist now seemed more like an unlikely catalyst, someone whose actions, however initially unsettling, were prompting a re-evaluation I hadn't realized was needed. He hadn't just offered an explanation, he'd offered a new perspective on Richard, on his work, and even indirectly on our life together. Thank you, Mark, I said, as we waited for the check. Thank you for being so honest with me. It's given me a lot to think about. He smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached his eyes. The pleasure was all mine, Helen, and please, if you ever have any concerns, or if you think I can help Richard in any way, don't hesitate to reach out. Sometimes an outside perspective, even a slightly meddling one like mine, he added with a self-deprecating chuckle, can be useful. He paid for our lunch despite my protests, and as we stood outside the cafe ready to part ways, he paused. Yauk no, Helen, he said, his tone thoughtful. Richard is lucky to have someone like you looking out for him. Someone who cares enough to seek out answers. Not everyone has that. His words were simple, but they resonated deeply. It was a moment of unexpected connection, a recognition of shared care for Richard, albeit from very different standpoints. It wasn't romantic, not in the slightest, but it was deeply emotional. A sense of people understanding each other on a level that transcended workplace dynamics or social pleasantries. It was based on mutual respect, a respect that had grown in the space of a single honest conversation. Walking away from the cafe, my mind was buzzing. The city streets, which had seemed so ordinary just an hour before, now felt vibrant with new possibilities. Mark's explanation about his comment, his frustration with Ricardna aiming higher not because he was incapable, but because he was capable. It was a revelation. It wasn't an insult. It was, in its own clumsy way, a compliment. It suggested that Richard wasn't seen as fading away, but as a valuable asset whose full potential was perhaps being underutilized, or who was too modest to push himself forward. This painted a picture of Richard's work life that was far more nuanced than his usual grumbles about bureaucracy had ever conveyed. I realized how much I had taken Richard's career for granted, how little I truly understood about the daily pressures, the ambitions, the interpersonal dynamics he navigated. I had seen him as Stia Dierkerd, the reliable provider, and perhaps in doing so I had inadvertently referendified the very coasting that Jenkins had initially, and I now understood, mistakenly seemed to accuse him of the experience, left me feeling profoundly changed. The initial feeling of being torn had transformed into a sense of clarity, and with it, a surge of purpose. I no longer felt like a passive observer in Richard's life or a victim of office gossip. I felt empowered, enlightened. This was my personal discovery that sometimes the things that shake us out of our comfort zones are not threats, but opportunities for growth, for deeper understanding. That evening I looked at Richard with new eyes. He was sitting in his armchair reading the newspaper, that picture of contentment, but now I saw beyond the quiet facade. I saw the brilliant engineer Mark Jenkins had described, the man with so much experience and so much yet to offer, and I felt a renewed sense of love and admiration for him, coupled with a gentle resolve to be a more active partner in encouraging his passions, not just his comfort. I didn't immediately tell Richard about my lunch with Mark. It felt like something I needed to process first to understand its implications for him, for us. That you won't believe what happened. Part of this story isn't some dramatic confrontation or office scandal. It's something quieter, more internal, but no less profound. It's about how a piece of negative gossip led to an unexpected connection with a supposed adversary, and how that connection opened my eyes to the subtle ways we can inadvertently limit ourselves and the people we love by settling into comfortable narratives. What happened was that I started to see my husband and my marriage with a fresh perspective. I realized that my desire for Richard's comfort and contentment might have inadvertently stifled a part of him that still yearned for challenge, for recognition, for making that real mark Jenkins had spoken of. Over the next few weeks, I began to gently encourage Richard to talk more about his work, not just the frustrations, but the aspects he found engaging, the ideas he had. I listened more actively, asked more questions. I suggested he consider mentoring some of the younger engineers, something he'd briefly mentioned wanting to do years ago, but had never pursued. To my surprise, he was receptive. It was as if a dormant part of him was reawakening. He started talking about a new project initiative with a spark in his eye I hadn't seen in years. He even mentioned with a wry smile that Jenkins fellow had been surprisingly supportive of some of his more innovative ideas. Turns out he's not just a slick talker, Richard admitted. One evening, he actually knows his stuff, and he's pushing for some changes that might actually be good. I never told Richard the full story of Carol's warning or the depth of my initial anxieties. Some things I decided were best left as my own journey, but I did eventually mention casually that I'd run into Mark Jenkins downtown and had a brief, pleasant chat. Richard just nodded, accepting it without much curiosity, already preoccupied with a new design challenge he was sketching out on Anatepad. And that was okay. The real change wasn't in some dramatic revelation to Richard, but in me. My interaction with Mark Jenkins, born out of a misunderstanding and a desire to protect my husband, had led to an unexpected alliance of sorts. It had taught me about the importance of seeking understanding before judgment, about the complex humanity that exists even in people we're predisposed to dislike. It taught me that coasting isn't always about a lack of ambition, but sometimes about a lack of opportunity or encouragement. And it taught me that emotional connection and mutual respect can blossom in the most unexpected of places, even between a concerned wife and her husband's ambitious younger colleague. My world didn't dramatically explode, but it subtly, meaningfully expanded. I learned that sometimes what seems like a betrayal or a criticism from the outside can actually be a mirror reflecting back not just on the person being discussed, but on ourselves and the roles we play in each other's lives. The reflection I saw wasn't entirely comfortable, but it spurred a growth in me, and I believe a renewed vibrancy in Richard that I wouldn't trade for anything. And that I think is something worth sharing.